For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Rekgotsofetse Chikane discusses his book titled Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation. The book is a first-hand account of the university protest that crippled our country between the 2015 and 2017, known as the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall. Why did you see a need to write this book?
So I actually wrote this, so I've been telling a lot of people this, I actually wrote this book for 5 people only. That is my whole target market right now. And the 5 people will know it when they read it. I won't say their names. And it was to say, if we don't write these stories ourselves, someone else will, which is exactly what happened. So there was a professor at UCT who wrote about Rhodes Must Fall. He got a collection of his friends. He's the same professor who compared Rhodes Must Fall to the Taliban, which is an interesting comparison. A little litmus test of where the country was at the time. And he wrote the first Rhodes Must Fall book. And it was a horrible depiction of the movement that completely misled, had no insight of what was happening inside the movement. So this is my attempt to say I'm challenging other people in the country who are student leaders, very prominent student leaders, much better writers than I am, to go off and tell their stories, otherwise someone else will do it on our behalf, which is not the greatest thing in the world.
Do you think there are similarities if we look at the current youth politics as well as the previous upheavals like the Soweto uprising in 1976?
Yeah, so I mentioned in the book, and I go through this trace of society as a whole allows young people to fight some of the battles that older generations aren't willing to fight or can't see there's an issue with. And Rhodes Must Fall Rhodes Must Fall, Rhodes Must Fall, because they are quite intertwined, is, in my mind, the first time that young people in a post-democratic South Africa said there's something fundamentally wrong with our society and the way it functions. Right? We have normalized injustice, and we do not accept this normalization anymore. And the only people who can do that are those who haven't lived in that system long enough to become okay with injustice. You need a generation who says, I don't want to grow up in this injustice. And I think that's what allows young people that motive, essentially, to really advocate for certain change. So I think it's very similar to 1976 and the 1980s, more so the 1980s, the protests that rocked the Western Cape against the education system there. So I think there's large similarities.
What does the title of this book mean?
So the original title of the book was supposed to be Everything Must Fall. Hashtag Everything Must Fall, but it didn't speak to the heart of what I was trying to say. It painted too negative of a picture. And what I really wanted to get across was the student protests were not meant to tear apart this country for the sake of tearing it apart. The protests were about how do we become introspective and retrospective about the state of the country, and how do we build it forward? And I thought, well, one of the metaphors, and I mentioned this in the book, is the Rainbow Nation metaphor. So a lot of protesters will say, no, we hate this metaphor. It's misleading. It's not the best way to describe how people come together. Nelson Mandela used it, and he didn't use it appropriately for us. It's not applicable. The older generation will say, well, what did you expect from us? After 1994, there was so much division. We needed a way to come together. And I say, well, how do I take these two different views? And the Rainbow Nation metaphor for me is the best description of our country. It's all these colors that run in parallel with one another into infinity. And that perfectly describes our country. People of different ethnicities, races, classes are unified in their diversity, but aren't able to recognize what makes us different. And I think that lack of insight describes of everyone running in parallel with one another into infinity and being comfortable. And I'm saying, no, that's not the type of country I want to live in.
You say that your father, Frank Chikane, believes that we can change through reform, while you believe that we can only improve through revolution. Tell us more about that argument.
Yes, me and my dad have had some fantastic discussions over the years. I think my political school has been morning conversations with him before we need to go our separate ways. Yeah. My dad comes from a generation who fought tooth and nail to end the most oppressive system I think this world has come across in the modern day era. Right? An oppressive system that actively said, if you are black, you are less than human. Right? And they managed to do something extraordinary and end that system, right, in a non-violent manner. Now, there was a lot of violence, a lot of killings that happened, but to see what could have happened makes you reflect back and say, this was amazing. So they've done this miraculous attempt to bring the country together, and now he's sitting in government. Now, when you sit in government, you can't just make decisions. He's a very procedural individual. He says the Constitution is there for a reason. We worked very, very hard to create what it is. We're going to follow the Constitution tooth and nail. And any changes that must happen should be in the context of the Constitution, right? And that's the type of reform he would have. I have nothing against the Constitution whatsoever. But I make an example in the book of if certain people use the Constitution in a way that normalizes injustice, then we have a problem, right? And I make an example of a group called 1652s in particular, and I say they use the Constitution to eradicate the black experience of injustice in society. And they say, but because we have this Constitution, we're good and we're better. And for me, it's not about getting rid of the Constitution, but having a complete overhaul of how we approach it. And that's the type of revolution I think we should have.
You also refer to the Rhodes Must Fall movement, that it was inevitable. Why do you say that? So
Rhodes Must Fall was a long time coming at the University of Cape Town. The University of Cape, so for instance, the first time, I have to double check this number, but it was in the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. The first recorded protest against the statue of Cecil John Rhodes was in the 1950s. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that. It's in the book though. And it was by Afrikaans students at the University of Cape Town who said, why do we have a statue of a genocidal maniac on campus? Because that's what Rhodes represented to the Afrikaner community at the time. That's the first recorded protest. But the protest wasn't necessarily about that statue, even back then. The protest was, the university has not created a space that is conducive to people who are not white, male, English speaking, and that was at the time, in the 1950s. And the presence of the statue exasperates that. And I like using that example because people are like, oh, black people just don't like the statue. It's like, no, people don't like this person. And the presence of that statue is indicative of other things. So Rhodes Must Fall UCT has all these protests. And Rhodes Must Fall was luck more than anything else. There had been tensions brewing at the university over a good decade at that point. Racial tensions of people trying to re-understand what it means to be black on campus. And in the span of about 3 months, a few random things happen. A few weird moments happen that all culminate with one individual, Umani, throwing poo at the statue. Now, it wasn't the act of throwing poo at the statue that formed Rhodes Must Fall. It was just a catalyst that said we should all come together for a particular meeting. And at that meeting, the decision was made, we should probably have a movement. At the time, we didn't call it Rhodes Must Fall. It was a horrible name at the time. The Rhodes Must Fall, the name is more by accident than anything else. People were like, oh, fantastic, they thought about this. It's like, no, we just didn't have enough paint to do the full name that we wanted. And it emerged that way. And that's why I think it was knocking on the door. It would have happened eventually. When you make black students on campus feel like they are visitors on that campus, you are in for a storm eventually.
Were you in any way directly affected by the hashtag Fees Must Fall protests?
It depends on how you see it. So I mentioned this, I come from a political grouping in this, I call myself a political baby, upper middle class, and got mostly scholarships throughout my education experience. So when I went into Fees Must Fall, it was never, oh, I'm fighting for my own fees. Because I had managed to get scholarships in one way or another. And at the back of my mind, I knew if my parents really had to do it, they could probably pay for the fees. How I was affected by the fee discussion was seeing how my family was affected by it. How my cousin, I remember us standing, I tell a lot of these stories in the book, and one of them that sticks in my mind is the year before the stampede that happened at UJ that killed the mother because of fees. I was standing in that line with my cousin the year before. We got there at about 3 a.m. With a line that circled outside of the university, with people all standing there saying, we missed our chance to apply for university. We're hoping that we get in now. Because back then, university still allowed for people to do late registration, essentially. And seeing my cousin go through that, was interesting. My time on the SRC saw brilliant students, extremely intelligent students, being kicked out of the university not because they weren't intelligent enough, but because they couldn't afford their fees. And in a country where inequality is the way it is, no one in this country can say inequality is okay. Everyone understands that inequality in South Africa in particular is dire. So in the same breath to say, these students, acknowledging that there's a dire inequality, they must still pay exorbitant fees, doesn't make sense. And that didn't sit well with my conscience. So Fees Must Fall was my attempt at making my conscience feel better. To say that I tried and I fought. And if someone ever had to ask me years from now, I can never say that I did nothing. And I guess I get that from my dad. I think I learned that lesson from him. But it's that view of, if my kids ever ask me, but how did you allow the society to exist the way it did? I'll have my answer to say, no, I did my bit, now it's your time.
When you talk about the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall movement, why do you come out in support of Chumani?
Yeah, Chumani I support and don't support. So Rhodes Must Fall Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall are filled with unholy alliances. That's the best way to describe it. People who should never be in alliance with each other in any ordinary circumstance. But during Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, extraordinary circumstances arose that forced people who were usually always at loggerheads with each other to compromise and say, how do we come together? This doesn't mean that we justify people's actions. And you'll see a lot of people will think fallism just started, right? So we sat in a room and we thought of the ideology of fallism. Fallism began because there were so many contestations. So at one point, the woman in the movement said, no, we've seen this movie play out before. Of a black movement emerges, the men move up to the top, and then they erase the woman completely. And brilliant, strong woman in the movement said, no, we're not going to repeat that. We're going to actively claim our space. And through that act, you have the emergence of black radical feminism emerging in this space by force. It wasn't negotiated. It was by force it will be here. So you have all those different contestations. Now, Chumani is particularly interesting because he did become the face of the movement. He became the face for the general public. Within the movement, that wasn't necessarily the case across the board. And you see those contestations, 2016, when the women of the movement accused a lot of the dominant men across the country of saying, you can't have a random sneaky conference and say, in this conference, we have decided that we're going to shut down Wits University. So Chumani and the crew, they marched down to Wits University, and the women at Wits University said, there's not a chance. One fantastic student, Tinjiwe, who's gone through the most at that university, and they owe her a lot, and Rhodes University owes her a lot, said, no, I refuse, and went to Braamfontein and picked up a shambok to come whip the guys. And it was an act of revolt to say, just because your face is famous doesn't mean that your mind is the right mind that we need to lead this movement. And those type of interactions constantly happen. However, sometimes you need them. So it's always a compromise. It probably led to our downfall in different ways, but it's fun.
In chapter 11, you say that while you were writing this book, you found yourself angry at your parents and at all the generations who came before you. You say they seem to have failed. Why was that? So
I use this metaphor of a relay race. Anyone who's run a relay race, super exciting. I used to run like the last leg, feeling like a champion. But when you watch a relay race, there's always that moment where you're watching your teammate run his leg of 100 meters, right? And then you watch him or her hand over a baton to the next person, and you watch that over and over again until it comes to you. And in our case, the handing over of baton was the handing over of the apartheid generation struggle heroes who fought against the system, and handing over the baton to us to say, you must now continue this fight. Now, the problem about a relay race is when you drop the baton, there's this awkward moment where both people are angry with each other, and both people will blame each other. It's almost instinctual. And then there's a decision of who must then pick up the baton. And usually it is the person who dropped the baton who must pick it up and give it to the next person. But if you can't agree on who's dropped it, then you're just wasting time. And I think the past 20 years was a generation who were living off a high of ending apartheid. And I'm quite critical of, I think they dropped the baton. and they didn't pick it up to give it to us. So when we forced the issue and said, we'll mobilize and we'll pick up this baton ourselves, we then got shouted at because of doing that. But we don't have time to have that argument. We picked up the baton and we ran. And as I was writing this book, I realized a lot of anger came out of 20 plus years disappeared, right? Not to say not good it didn't happen. This country has moved on immensely since then. But when you still have the type of inequality that is racialized, when you still have the majority of young people, over 66% now, I think the stats have changed, of young people being unemployed, when you have 4 million, just under 4 million, 18 to 35-year-olds who are not employed in education or any form of training. They're just sitting at home, and our country says, yeah, we're fine with that. That is a problem that I have. And I think if the older generation won't fix it, then we have to fix it. And they mustn't be angry with how we do it.
Lastly, what else do you think the readers will get without giving too much away?
Without giving too much. So a lot of people will be surprised because I try and explain that in order to understand what happened in Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall and during those years, you need to understand how people got to that point. Because most people are like, oh, the students, they're so violent. Oh, they're such hooligans, they're gangsters, they're criminals, they don't know what they're doing. And I say, no, there's a logic to the chaos, and there's chaos to the logic. And I try and explain how we got to certain points. I use myself as an example a lot in the book, because I want to be self-reflective, and I want people to question me as well, because I didn't get questioned enough at times, which is a problem. So I use myself, so that's one thing. I talk about general youth politics, and big things that happen, and vacuums that needed to be filled by by organizations like Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. And I also touch on, I think, one of the most underwritten stories in our country about the silent revolution in universities. And this is essentially, if you think Fees Must Fall started in 2015, you are so wrong. Because if you think Fees Must Fall is a fee-related protest or finance-related protest on a university campus, whether it's fees, finances, residences, if you think that is a finance fees-related issue and there's a protest, we've been having Fees Must Fall since the 90s. It's just that it's not been in our eyesight. And one of the underlying themes is how easy it is for whether you're a white South African, a black South African, to overlook some of the normalization of injustice in our society. That you could have a whole generation lose their education at a university level because of fees, and just because a previously white university says we're angry with this as well, the country says we should all be angry. It speaks to the psyche of the country, and I try and elaborate that in the book and ask the questions of who you should trust, who you shouldn't trust. Should you even trust me as the writer of this book as an authority on this? I don't think people should, but they must write their own books though. Preferably not when mine is coming out.
That was Rekgotsofetse Chikane speaking to Polity about his book titled Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation.